Thanks everyone for being here. Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Oh, perfect. I'm really thrilled to welcome everyone to this webinar on ballot question 6, which proposes moving our local elections to high turnout presidential years in New York City to boost voter turnout. I am Grace Rao. I'm the relatively new executive director of Citizens Union. I know some of you on this call, but for others, we may be meeting for the first time. I joined Citizens Union in June of this year, and I'm just really thrilled to be leading this organization at such an important time for our city. And just want to thank all of you for taking the time to tune in to this Q&A tonight to learn more about ballot question number 6. We are joined by our policy director at Citizens Union, Ben Weinberg, and Amory Dujardin, our policy manager, who are going to be walking everyone through a presentation on the ballot question, and then we will open it up for Q&A. One of the things I've been so impressed by since joining Citizens Union in June is just how much really in-depth policy research this organization and team has done on this issue in particular. We have really been sort of the leading researchers and a resource to lawmakers as well as the City Charter Revision Commission as it considered whether or not to advance this election reform and put it on the ballot. So just know that the data and the research that we are sharing with you tonight has been really at the forefront of this conversation happening across New York. So thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Amory.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. I really appreciate the introduction and putting this all in context. I am going to share my screen real quick so we can get the slides back up. And there we go. So everyone should be able to now see the slides up on your screen. So uh, I will start by giving a 10 to 15-minute presentation on our research on this topic, which we've been studying since 2021. Then from there, we will open it up to questions and answers from the audience. That portion of the meeting, I will have or our Director of Public Policy, Ben Weinberg, who Grace mentioned earlier, join us to help facilitate the conversation. But if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and we will revisit them after the presentation. Then from there, we really hope this to be a question and answer and participatory discussion where you all will be involved. That all being said, just lay some ground rules here first. We do expect appropriate participation. First, please keep yourself on mute except for when you are asking a question. Second, please try and keep questions and comments brief and short so we can try to get to everyone's questions that they may have. And third, please keep your comments appropriate and avoid disparaging other people and their thoughts and opinions. We reserve the right to mute or remove people from the meeting who display inappropriate behavior or consistently ignore such guidelines. So thank you for working with us on that. So this webinar is to understand ballot question 6 in New York City. Ballot question 6 says move the city's primary and general election dates so that city elections are held in the same year as federal presidential elections when permitted by state law. A yes vote would move city elections to the same year as federal presidential elections when permitted by state law, and no leaves the law unchanged. So why is this on the ballot? Let's try and answer those questions for you now. 2 seconds here. Sorry, my button to move the slides is blocked. Great. So voter turnout in odd year elections or odd year municipal elections is very low. Fewer voters cast ballots in local elections than ever before in the previous mayor's election and hit a record low of 23% turnout. And I'll show you where that is in the graph in a second. But these are the elections that matter most for our communities and are held when voter attention is its lowest and voter fatigue is at the highest after a presidential election. And so we would be looking to, or so this ballot question would be looking to potentially change that. Right now, the people who decide these elections in odd years are a small subset of New Yorkers. And it thus is a real challenge to the democratic legitimacy of our local government. So as you can see here, this blue line represents the presidential elections. Um, that we experienced in New York City and the turnout. From the early 90s, you can see this was around 66% and has stayed hovering around 60% even to 2024. Gubernatorial elections, they're a little bit more all over the place. It really depends on who's on the ballot and what offices, are they competitive and such. But here you can see the turnout for mayor has been dwindling since 1989 and really hit a low in 2021 when it was just 23%. Again, we really think that this is a real challenge to the democratic legitimacy of our government. Moving local elections to even years dramatically increases turnout wherever it's been done. We're not the first ones on this. We're far from it if we decide to do this. Uh, States have done this already. California did it statewide, Arizona, Nevada, West Virginia. New York State actually did this for county and town elections. So this would potentially start expanding that process to cities as well. Over 100 cities nationwide have moved their elections as well outside of these states. So we're not alone in this problem of low turnout during municipal elections. You can see here Los Angeles. Oops, sorry about that. In Los Angeles, 20% of people used to turn out prior to their switch. Um, to even year elections for mayor. And then when that move did happen to hold their mayoral elections in even years, it jumped to 44%. In Phoenix, it jumped from 22% to 77%. So you're seeing across the board here in all these cities, massive increases in turnout compared to the previous years, anywhere from 90% to even 400% difference in El Paso, Texas, right here. So the amount of people that we could bring into our even year election or into our municipal elections by shifting them to an even numbered years like presidential years would be very large. Um, Moving local elections to even years, though, doesn't just increase turnout for the mayoral election specifically, but it increases turnout for the elections further down the ballot in for city council or the ballot questions. Um, for example, in 2024. Proposition 6, placed at the back of the ballot and sharing space with national and state races in New York City, received more than double the votes cast in the 2021 mayoral election. In Baltimore, for example, last year, a ballot question placed 21st on the ballot on page number 4 of that ballot received 53% of the voter turnout. So for those concerned about ballot drop-off, you can see from the yellow and red lines here specifically in these examples from Los Angeles and Baltimore, what the turnout was for the mayoral race. So let's just take Los Angeles here in 2017. The turnout was 409,000 Um, and in 2022, the turnout for the mayoral race spiked to 930,000. But the lowest ballot proposal had a turnout of 888,000 still. So that turnout for that ballot proposal was still more than twice as much as the vote totals for mayor in the city. We're not just increasing turnout for the mayoral election, we're increasing turnout for races like city council and the ballot questions that are inevitably on the ballot each year too. Um, Another problem, though, with that we found in our research with odd year elections is that they are older, whiter, and wealthier voters. So odd year elections result in significant racial and ethnic disparities in participation and severely depress youth turnout. It has been documented in all the studies on the topic. The additional costs of voting in those years for occasional voters or voter fatigue mean that odd year elections disproportionately impact communities of color and young voters. For example, a Harvard election law study of the state of New York State found that in 2021, turnout among minority groups was 54% of white turnout compared to 20% when it was 85% of white turnout. And one comparison of 50 cities across the nation found that the median voter in odd year mayoral elections is 17 years older than the median adult in that city, but only 4.7 years older in the mayoral elections and presidential years. So moving local elections to even years would be a solution to this because it draws a much more representative electorate. Um, in a study conducted by former U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch for this specific ballot measure, it found that in presidential years, turnout among Black and Asian voters triples, and Latino turnout increases nearly 5 times. Young voters are far more engaged too. Turnout for them it was 12% in odd years, and it would jump to roughly 58% in presidential years. So that's what you can see here in these two graphs as well. Some other positive impacts that moving mayoral elections to even numbered years could have include saving money and the policy's popularity. So the New York City um, independent budget office conducted its own study into the benefits of this policy and discovered that the city could save $42 million in savings every 2 years from election consolidation. With concerns about the future of our budget and the federal cuts that are happening, from the federal cuts that are happening and affecting New York City's budget, $42 million is not nothing. It can go a long way. But we're also beyond that seeing a lot of strong support from voters across party lines. So this poll right up here in the top right corner, talks about how we see broad support from Republicans and Democrats and independents, and then young voters and older voters and voters of different races and likely voters. So this is a lot strong support across the board. But civic and community and voting rights groups also support this change. So you can see a list of those sample organizations in support of this policy in the bottom right corner. Uh, you know, for example, one of those organizations and one of those community groups, I should say, are voters with disabilities. So under federal law and thus the various advocacy groups that support this policy, one of those advocacy groups are often voters with disabilities. Under federal election law, these voters are protected in federal elections with various standards that must be met. Um, and uh, and the voters are then voters with disabilities are then afforded certain protections that they are not afforded during odd year elections. And so that is another positive of this change. Candidates also, though, support this. We surveyed a whole group of people, a whole group of candidates in the primary, and we found that 87% of city council candidates that we surveyed at the time in the primary supported this change. 7 out of the 8 mayoral candidates did, and 100% of the controller, public advocate, and Manhattan Borough president candidates also supported this change. So let's see here. Uh, excuse me, sorry, I need to move that. Okay. So really, this is a chance to bring more New Yorkers into New York City's local democracy. National elections bring intense media coverage, which drives public interest and participation. Holding these local elections when more people are paying attention rather than a small subset of New Yorkers will elevate the visibility of local candidates, offices, and issues. We already see this today. Assembly and Senate candidates, or I should say state assembly and Senate candidates, often campaign on the same local issues as the city council candidates, but they reach more voters and receive more attention simply because more people are tuned in during a federal election cycle. Odd year elections might get dedicated press coverage, but it reaches very few people. Voter turnout in the last mayoral election was 23%. It is typically 60% in presidential years. Research and experience shows that the participation itself drives that information seeking. And when people are mobilized to vote, they learn about the candidates and issues in the process. If we want more New Yorkers to understand local politics, the most effective approach is to ensure more of them encounter a ballot that includes races for mayor, controller, or city council. Currently, most New York City voters do not. We also hear from nonprofits and we also hear from nonprofits engaged in voter education that funding for engagement efforts dries up during odd years. Given the added cost of reaching infrequent voters who face voter fatigue or confusion when asked to vote again, it is far more efficient to include local voter education in years when broader outreach efforts are already underway. In addition, and I should say lastly, really, when voters are engaged in national politics, they often seek ways to get involved locally, especially in a place like New York, which rarely offers an opportunity to affect the national elections. So consider 2018, the surge in public interest around flipping the US House after Trump's election. It trickled down into local interest and voter mobilization around the state Senate and the Independent Democratic Caucus in New York State. More recently, high-profile mayor races in San Francisco, Baltimore, and Los Angeles have drawn this significant attention too, even when held alongside presidential or midterm elections. So there are a lot of positives that our research sees from hosting these elections in even years. But how will this transition happen? While this graphic is great and explains how this transition will happen, what you really need to understand is that Prop 6 establishes a transition mechanism, but a future constitutional amendment decided in Albany will have the final say. So if that future constitutional amendment in Albany goes with the transition mechanism suggested by this ballot question, the most likely scenario is that you'll see a constitutional amendment passed in the first legislature, passed twice, first in the legislature next year, and then in the legislative session between 2027 to 2028. And then that would go toward the voters in 2028. And then if passed then, the next New York City mayoral election would establish 3-year terms, and the first even year election would be 2032. But again, we really want to emphasize that Albany and the state legislature will have the final say on this. So There's not much use going into too much into how this exactly will happen until we see more from them. So with that, I will have my colleague Ben Weinberg, our Director of Public Policy, join us now to help facilitate the discussion and answer questions. Ben, what questions do we have?
Great. Hi, everyone. Um, Thanks for everyone who joined. It's great to see some familiar faces here. I think we're going to start with a question by Gina in the chat. Gina Anderson, I hope I'm pronouncing your name well. And she's asking, does this proposed change affect primary elections? And I think I can take that. So this would move all the elections that are held in relation to the municipal elections, so both general and primary elections, to the presidential election year. So that means the general election would move to November, and the primary election would move to June of a presidential year. It would not move that primary election from to a different month, like from June to September. We used to have primaries in September. They'll all be in June, and yeah, I think that's the question. Um, if uh, if there are any other questions, now is the time to raise your hand or drop them in the chat or ask to unmute. We muted everyone and kind of disallowed everyone to unmute themselves because of the incident we had earlier. So if you want to ask a question, either through the mic or in the chat, now's the time. I'm gonna give it a minute, but I already see one question coming in. Give me a second um, as I read them. So I see the last question coming in from Claude. It sounds like the change contemplated by the proposition could not change the length of the term and official elected November 2025. That is correct, Claude, and thank you for asking that very clarifying question. This would not impact the whoever is elected in a few next week, really. Not the mayor or anyone else on that ballot in city government, but basically in future office holders.
Ben, why don't I go ahead and read the next question?
Sure, great, thank you.
Janet asked, language barriers and limited time amongst working class citizens or seniors may affect their ability to make more informed decisions if local races and matters are suppressed by presidential races. Holding local elections alongside general elections will encourage voter turnout rate, but how do you deal with rushed and uninformed voting?
I think that's an excellent question, Janet, and I'll take it. And Emer, if you want to add anything later, please do. So we hear that question a lot. Folks are asking, uninformed voters. I mean, are we just getting many more voters to vote in our local elections, but they'll be uninformed about the local issues or offices? And I think the first thing we always try to remind ourselves is that knowledge is really not a criteria for voting in this country, thankfully. So, we don't check if voters are kind of qualified in terms of their knowledge and familiarity with the federal government or with the scope of presidential power or with the separation of powers or what Congress does when we ask them to vote in even numbered years. And thank God, and we know that unfortunately many voters that vote for president for other office are probably what we call quote unquote uninformed. But I also think it's important to remember that getting more folks to vote for local offices will actually create a more informed city about local issues and local offices, right? Um, we know from research that participation actually drives information seeking. So when folks are heading to the polls, I'm sure you all have those friends that are heading to the polls and are not sure what to vote on, and they Google what's on the ballot this year. and they text you, what is a judge, what does a council member do, or in even year elections, they would text you other questions about um, party positions, or even an assembly member. So that's exactly what we in the long run will help us create a more informed city on local issues, on local offices. If we want voters to learn more about how city government works, what we should do is get the ballot that says, New York City Controller in front of their eyes. So then they start thinking about it, and they are encouraged and motivated to ask more about these questions. We see that even this year, and we'll see that in I'm sure in other years.
Great.
Um,
No, I think that was a good answer. So I don't really have too much to add. But I think one of the things that you just said will pertain to this next question from Ellen, who asked, she knows someone who voted against number six because he felt the presidential election would overwhelm the local elections in terms of content. And he once worked in local government. How do you combat information overload from the presidential election?
Thanks, Amory, and thanks, Ellen. That's a great question. And we hear that from folks, and I think uh a very legitimate concern, right? We want to make sure that voters can handle the ballot and can handle that election. And so something we often hear is that local elections will be overwhelmed, drowned out, and these sort of issues. Um, what we try to remind folks is that more people voting in local elections actually means more visibility to local issues, more visibility to local office. Because currently, it's true that kind of municipal offices are more or less the only thing on the ballot. Um, but fewer than 1 in 4 New Yorkers actually get to, in a way, think about them because they don't vote in that election. So, I think Amory started this presentation by saying, unfortunately, we're voting for the offices that are most important for our daily lives and our communities and our neighborhoods when voter attention is lowest. So the people who do pay attention are the folks, are have kind of all have the local government all to themselves in that sense that, it's the only thing we think about. But we always have to remember that more than 2/3 of the city doesn't actually vote in those elections. So um, if the way we think about, if local elections are already overwhelmed and drowned out by just our daily lives and everything that is happening during an off-year election that excludes folks from the ballot. There's a reason very few voters vote in those odd year, and that is because it doesn't draw attention. News don't cover these elections usually. And it's just, as we mentioned, voter fatigue is highest.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Um, James Clapp asked a pretty good question too. Don't you think it is useful to have mayoral elections when we know who the new president is and have had almost a year's experience with him or her, and thus can evaluate mayoral candidates in part on the basis of how they propose to work with or deal with the new presidential administration?
Emery, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a good question, James. I think, we haven't been asked that before, but for what it's worth, I think that you could definitely you have two candidates at that point running for president, and those questions to the various mayoral candidates that are left are also at that time still valid. So if you were um, if take last year and it was Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I think the mayoral candidates this year uh, would be able to answer how they would work with either one of those candidates, and moreover demonstrate a little bit of range too, and how will they approach dealing with one person versus how they approach dealing with another. Will um, will one person uh, Sorry, will one candidate apply the same approach or to both candidates for president, or will the mayoral candidate have one approach for one person and one approach for the other? I think it could be pretty revealing as well. So, I mean, it really kind of depends on how you what positives and negatives you see from both options. But I don't think that question necessarily would go away. That all being said, this change is really about getting is really about enfranchising millions of voters in New York City to vote for their vote in local elections and dictating and having a say in how this city is run, whether or not it's on city council or to president. And I think that is super valuable compared to how we know that a mayoral candidate will work with a president or someone else in the federal government. So.
Um, I saw Dan Kaminsky had his hand up earlier, so I'm gonna ask him to unmute and see if he wants to ask his question um, on mic.
Hey, yeah, it wasn't it was additional comment if that is acceptable if
Perfect.
we're just
Do it. Yep.
so I think that this question that got asked before about federal races drowning out local ones is, from my reading of it, the crux of the counter points that I'm seeing. And I'm seeing a lot of sort of limbed independent Democrats come out against it and all these groups for that reason. I think, Ben, the answer you gave was phenomenal. I'd say a few that I would add in addition, if anyone wants even more sort of other perspective on that question, is I've worked in campaigns and I can tell you that on local races, you focus on the 20% of voters who vote. And so I think if now all of a sudden in your district, it's possible that 60% of your district is going to vote, it's going to lead to more information, not less, right? I think it's kind of counterintuitive to say more voters means less information. I think it's quite possibly the opposite. And so I think there's that sort of campaign side perspective that now the campaigns are reaching out not only to more people, but to non-traditional voters in local races, younger voters, voters of color, et cetera. And then if we think about what informed voting means on a macro scale, right? Not on the micro scale, on the level of the individual voter, but on the macro from a citywide perspective, if our voting currently is skewed, demographically speaking, I would say, again, on the macro scale, we are not informed voting as a city. Whereas if we are having a representative swath of New Yorkers vote that looks like New York, that is informed voting because people bring their full selves to the polls. People bring their identities, their socioeconomic status, their backgrounds, and that I don't think there can be any more informed voting than that. So that would be a few additional points, but to the wonderful and awesome points that you made, I'll add actually one more, which is that currently we vote for assembly on even years. And assembly is the smallest political jurisdiction. I think it's about 134,000, something like this. So we are already voting on neighborhood-based candidates on federal years where we're talking about president, right? So voters are already used to thinking about neighborhood issues, neighborhood candidates when they're going to polls, thinking about bigger issues as well. So it's not a totally new political muscle that's happening. So adding in a few arguments to that, but I think that is, again, like a crucial point that is kind of happening in the discourse right now around the city to be thinking about as folks weigh in on this issue.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Dan.
Yeah,
That's
Dan.
that's great insight and a good perspective, or a good alternative perspective. I'll go back to one of the questions in the chat, but if you do have another question and want to have some input like Dan, feel free to raise your hand using the React button at the bottom of your screen. But Francie Scanlon asks, does this change afford, for example, a lazy New York City council member an opportunity to free ride the tail of an individual party ballot line? Ben, do you have any reaction to that?
I'm not sure what give me a second to so the one thing it will change in terms of the ability of some council members and some assembly members to run is that we won't see any more elected officials who, while they're in office, are running for another office, spending probably, the good part of the year in campaign, um, and still are able to keep their seat, right? So we see that often both with folks in Albany, assembly members or senators that are running for city council. We saw that just now this year, and we'll see, and sometimes we see the other way around, council members running for assembly or senate seats, and that is done because those elections are held in different years. One is in the odd year, and the other one is the even year. So that won't happen anymore, and we think that's a good thing. Um, I'm not sure if that free read the tale of an individual party ballot line. Um, I'm not totally sure what that means. So, Francis, if you're welcome to go off mute or further explain, or Amer, if you get the
No, I would love clarification too, but I'm looking for Francie in the chat.
in the,
And Francie, you're welcome to go off mute if you would like.
oh, we have to ask people to unmute actually. So I'm gonna
I
I'm
did
gonna do
that.
that to Francie. And in the meantime,
Yes.
oh,
Yeah,
there we go.
thanks.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks very much. You know, many politicians, i.e., elected officials, they gauge each other's street cred literally on how many votes they get in their most recent electoral cycle. So the return on investment for a politician in terms of influencing their peers, dictating agendas, expanding the scope of their influence within whatever legislative body they're a part of, is exponentially driven by how many votes they get. And of course, they all look to see what was the bottom line for each of them. It's not enough to win. It's how many raw votes did you get and by what percentage did you win? So by arguably usurping the off year elections, where if you haven't really been a robust legislator, you haven't introduced any new legislation, you haven't really engaged the community, you can get a free ride on this proposed proposition because you can maintain your status quo. And so long as the party with which you're still affiliated has its own bona fides and a strong top of the ticket, you can just keep on easing on down the road, term limits notwithstanding. So while I absolutely support the premise and the upside of the proposition, I still think one must be slightly wary of the perhaps unconsidered impact of the lazy legislator getting a free ride. Thanks so much.
Of course, thank you, Francie. I will, I'll take the first hack at addressing that, and Ben, feel free to jump in afterwards. But we've heard about potential lazy legislators or people that want to challenge certain legislators and not being able to do so in the past. But just as a reminder, the best years, so to speak, or the most successful years for insurgent candidates were during high turnout federal elections in 2018 and 2020. In New York State, the most often that this happens is usually under the left side of the party, so often DSA or such, or Working Families Party. Nearly all DSA state electeds were elected in 2018 and 2020. And in low turnout 2021, DSA candidates who often challenge incumbent legislators lost most of their races for city council. And so, it looks different in various places, but in New York City, the left tends to challenge the establishment here, and we're not, those challenges have been most successful, and thus a challenge against a lazy legislator could be most successful in even years, according to past examples.
Um,
Great,
I want to
Ben.
get to we have a question from Marilyn in the chat. I want to make sure we get to that. Marilyn asked, will the $40 million go back to the city or the state or partially to both budgets? So Marilyn is referring to the data point that we mentioned. The Independent Budget Office estimates that by conducting this change, we will be saving at least $42 million every other year, because we're basically kind of abolishing one election. The answer is that it will go back to the city. New York City government is solely responsible for funding election administration in New York. It has funded it very generously, and that's a good thing. So that means that city budget will have 42, it's probably even higher because elections are way more expensive these days because we have early voting and other important reforms that have made election administration a bit more expensive. So those tens of millions of dollars will go back to the city coffers.
Great. Thanks, Ben. We have one more question in the chat from Claude Millman. Claude asked, do you know of research supporting a hypothesis that interest groups are less likely to be able to impact an election if voter participation is higher?
I can take that. I think that's an excellent question, Claude. And one that, and I say that because I've been kind of entrenched in the academic research around this for years. So I know this is one of the key questions that actually scholars ask around election timing. There's data to show yes, and there's data to show no. So it's not a clear answer, and I apologize for that. But yes, some argue, and it would seem to stand to reason that when you get fewer voters, then interest group who are representing voting blocks have bigger share of the electorate and therefore have bigger electoral power. But the studies that have tracked through the results of elections after cities switched have not kind of got to a clear conclusion about who benefits, quote unquote, politically, who wins. Is it the progressives? Is it the moderates? Is it interest groups? And that might be because elections are so different and often determined on context and on the political culture of every city and state. So I'm sorry there's not a clear answer, but I'm happy to send you also the data that does exist on it.
Great. At this point, we don't have any other questions in the chat. It is 6:47, so we do have a couple more minutes for questions if people have them. We can say you have a question in the chat, and we can invite you to come off mute if so. And so if anyone has a question, feel free to raise their hand or such.
And if not, Amory, I think we had a couple of questions coming in through the email earlier that you forwarded me. We're
Great.
happy to do that as well. But I think there is a question.
So yeah, Janet asked again, New York City's public matching funds program empowers grassroots candidates. Empowers grassroots candidates. Presidential campaigns may absorb most of the public energy and resources. Therefore, They might, therefore, might local candidates lose vital fundings, volunteers, or attention?
Excellent question, Janet. I really love that question because we are such big supporters here at Citizens Union of the public matching funds program in New York City. You know, we've pushed for its establishment in the late 80s, and we're still supporting its expansion. We now have a public matching funds program at the state level that covers assembly races and state senate races and statewide races, and we're so glad that that important pro-democracy reform is in place. So we certainly want to strengthen those programs. Now, whether presidential campaigns would absorb public energy and resources and volunteers and attention and funding, I'm going to break it to two. In terms of volunteers, if you think of a presidential election, even, you know, if you think of last year, what we often see is that New Yorkers who really want to engage in the election take a bus, drive to Pennsylvania, or take, you know, Metro North and go somewhere upstate, and go door knocking. So we have a lot of kind of, I wouldn't call it wasted energy because these things are very important, but we also know every voter in Pennsylvania gets like 10 people not knocking their doors and calling them every minute before election day. So the amount of energy and interest in politics, it just surpasses what we see in an odd year election by a whole lot. Those energies will actually be able to be channeled, sorry, to New York City, because folks are just interested in getting involved in politics, you know, because electoral politics is in the air and it's good in the coverage, and people want to do something. So in that sense, we actually think, you know, there'll be more volunteers for local campaigns because there are more people who are interested in doing something. Amory mentioned 2018 when that was a big national election related to who will take the House after the first Trump election. But in New York State, that actually became a state Senate election, right? All these folks wanted to get involved in the what was used to be called the IDC Senate caucus, right? Trying to defeat local Senate state senators. So we know there's that kind of mechanism works. National attention on politics drives local action. And then going back to the issue of money, and resources, we'll still have the public matching funds. The public matching funds at the state level is now on even years, so it is aligned with the federal election. We just had the first rollout last year in 2024, and it was great. It worked well. And we also hear, just last note on resources, and I think it's important to remind, you know, we have a lot of conversations with organizations that do civic engagement and drive folks to the polls, and they get money during federal election cycle, and then the federal elections are over and money dries up because a lot of these funders are actually national funders who want to drive money, and they also think about electoral politics only in the federal cycle. So there's more resources for kind of overall, there's more resources for voter education, voter engagement during presidential year.
Great. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap it up, if anyone else has one. Otherwise, we will finish up by making a few plugs, but I will give it a minute and see if anyone raises their hand in the chat. Okay, well, if any questions are going, feel free to keep typing them. I'm gonna make a few more plugs here. Ben, do you have those links ready that I am going to
Sure.
that we're going to post in the chat? Great. So we want to say thank you for coming tonight. We really enjoyed tonight's discussion and hope you did too. Regardless of where you fall on this ballot question, if you've enjoyed our conversation tonight, join us for more of them. We're going to be increasing this programming, and there are several ways that you can get involved with Citizens Union. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Ben, if you wouldn't mind sharing the place that people can subscribe by putting it in the chat, that would be great. You can also join Citizens Union as a member to get access to our events and commit yourself to prioritizing anti-corruption, democracy, and ethics efforts that we work on within New York City. And so we will drop a link in the chat for you to do that. Or you can donate to our foundation, which conducts this research on this and so many other topics as well. Regardless of doing any of those, stay in touch and don't forget to vote. We will add that link and we will eventually get a recording of this event up so that we can send this to other voters in New York City. We'll email you all those links and put them in the chat as we mentioned. And thank you again for coming tonight. So if I don't see any more questions, which I do not. Uh, Thank you all again for being here. Oh, it looks like Kathy Collins has raised hand, so I'll let Kathy come off mute. Kathy, go
Yes,
ahead.
I just wanted to mention about, I had put it in the chat, but apparently I guess you didn't see it, about the protections that of HAVA would then be provided for people with disabilities because local elections then would be attached to federal elections and HAVA applies to federal elections. So that would give us great protections to bring complaints when our rights are violated with voting. And yes, even today, people with disabilities still have difficulties at times voting. And our right to vote is being attacked right now on the federal level. So that's important.
Thanks,
you.
Kathy. I appreciate that, and sorry, I didn't mean to ignore your comment. We had addressed that earlier on in the presentation, and but thank you for bringing that back up. Yes, you know, many civic organizations and groups have mentioned how this would help across the board and for voters with disabilities. Those protections that they're afforded in federal years, but not necessarily in odd years, are super important policy change to this potential timing switch in our elections as well. So thank you, Kathy. So thank you all again. It is 6:55, so we'll let you go a little early. I hope you all stay dry tonight, and thank you again. Hope you have a good evening.